Good morning. This is Tuesday, February 13th, the day before Valentine's Day, which in my occupation with my students is a big day. There will be balloons and flowers and teddy bears and hearts and candy all day long tomorrow. So we started yesterday. We're continuing on with our series on uh, the JFK assassination, and we have reached the point of the Medical Manhattan Project, which is relevant to the JFK assassination topic because it involves Lee Harvey Oswald in the summer of '63. And it also involves the Mexico City saga that we have spent quite a bit of time talking about. Of course, the CIA was very anxious to come up with an alibi for Oswald's presence in Mexico City, an alibi that was simultaneously diverting attention away from his real purpose to be there, but also incriminating. So they came up with a flim flam story, which fell apart pretty quick. So the reason we want to talk about it is because we want to talk about what was really going on. And yesterday we learned that this goes back to the invention of penicillin, which led to polio. Antibiotic destroyed all the good and bad bacteria. The good bacteria normally prevented the polio virus from reaching the brainstem, the bloodstream. But with the good bacteria gone, now that polio virus was reaching the bloodstream and then getting into the brainstem and causing all kinds of central nervous system issues, paralysis, death, and a lot of panic, because it was affecting mostly kids. Totally understandable. And so the government began working on a vaccine. Of course, this effort was led, and I made sure to note this because this is going to be a theme. Richard Nixon was the vice president at the time, mid 50s, and he was put in charge of this project by President Eisenhower. So all the decisions, when we talk about government making decisions during this period to go ahead with the vaccine, even when Dr. Bernice Eddy comes out and says, hey, there's some problems with it, the politicos making those decisions rise to the level of vice president. And Richard Nixon ultimately is responsible for this. So we talked about the big rollout of the vaccine. It was announced publicly, a lot of fanfare. University of Michigan, Jonas Salk, and then almost immediately we have the Cutter incident, which was predictable. Dr. Bernice Eddy predicted it. She said it's paralyzing and killing my monkeys. So what did it do? It paralyzed and killed a bunch of kids. So after 2 weeks, they have to pull the vaccine. And in a last ditch effort to save it, we talked about a doctor from New Orleans. I didn't mention this yesterday. I kind of hope somebody picked up on it, but it's not coincidental that this doctor was from New Orleans. Everything is emanating from New Orleans. This is where, when we reach the summer of '63, this is the epicenter of the JFK assassination plot. And you've got, think about all the different people that are circulating through and around in New Orleans at that time. Obviously, Lee Harvey Oswald's there, but you got Operation Mongoose, which is being run out of Guy Bannister's office with David Ferry and Clay Shaw, and Oswald's involved in that. You got Judith Ferry down there working a cover job at Riley Coffee with Oswald. Evenings working Medical Manhattan together with David Ferry and Dr. Mary Sherman, and under the guidance of Dr. Alton Ochsner, who was the same doctor who tried to save the polio vaccine we talked yesterday by inoculating his two grandkids in a very public way, killed his grandson, partially paralyzed his granddaughter. Same doctor. Everything seems to be percolating in New Orleans. New Orleans seems to be like the epicenter of everything. And of course, Carlos Marcello, the head of the crime boss down there, Jack Ruby's going to make an appearance that summer in New Orleans, buy a showgirl, Jada. He's going to buy her from Carlos Marcello. And so this is why District Attorney Jim Garrison brought that case in the late 60s because he realized what we're realizing now, which is the Dallas plot was really a New Orleans plot. Dallas just happened to be where the president's motorcade was. So that's where it went down. But a lot of the pre-planning that went into this assassination was emanating from New Orleans. Of course, all the Cubans were down there. It's quite a toxic brew down there in New Orleans. All right, so today the question we answered yesterday, you tried to answer, was how did medicine, or how did the polio vaccine get corrupted by politics and profiteering? Well, you saw why Dr. Ochsner tried so hard to save it. He had a stake in Cutter Labs. You saw why the politicians went ahead with the vaccine, even though they were warned it wasn't going to work. In fact, it was going to be counterproductive because they already had the doses ordered. They'd spent a lot of money getting all this together. And they had also made promises to the American people. They wanted to fulfill those promises. They didn't want to panic on their hands. So money has a lot to do with it. It always does. There was a lot of money to be made. There was a lot of money already invested. There was a lot of money at stake. And of course, the prestige and promises that the government made, nobody wants to go back on that. So they just plowed ahead. So today we want to look at a couple other topics, a couple other questions. Why did the government ignore Dr. Eddy's warnings again? Okay, so today, obviously, we're going to talk about another, because when we left it yesterday, the Salk vaccine has been jerked off the market, and that's opening the door for other competitors to produce a vaccine that will work. So evidently, another one's going to arrive, and Dr. Eddy's going to have something to say about it as well, and the government's going to ignore her again. So we want to answer that question today. Another question: how did the cure for the polio epidemic create 2 future epidemics? Boy, that's a $1 million question right there, and we will get into that as well. And then lastly, what did the government have to admit in 2013? Have to admit. The government never wants to admit, and they usually don't unless they're forced to. The evidence just becomes overwhelming, and then they belatedly admit something. So those are the 3 questions we're going to be looking at today as we continue Medical Manhattan Part 2. All right, so the door has been opened. Salk's vaccine has not, trying to move my face around here. I guess that'll work. Salk's vaccine has not done the trick. And his competitor, Dr. Albert Sabin, who's a Russian, had to go back to Russia. When Salk's vaccine went on the market, it effectively turned the entire United States into this laboratory or testing ground for Salk's vaccine. And so in order to be able to test his own, he had to go back to his native Russia and begin testing it there. And he came up with an oral application, basically the same vaccine, but a lighter dose. And instead of applying it or injecting it straight into the bloodstream, which is a problem because it's too strong to begin with, and then it goes straight into the blood, and there's nothing to break it down. And it ended up being too strong, overwhelmed the immune system. Well, Sabin's vaccine was a sugar cube, and you could see it was administered on your tongue. You would take the sugar cube. I think my parents had this, my parents' generation. So you'd put the sugar cube on your tongue and it would dissolve. So then it would go through the digestive tract, the digestive system, eventually into the bloodstream. By that time, it was a lighter dose to begin with. And then secondly, because it's being digested, then into the bloodstream, it's a light enough dose that the immune system can fight it off. And so it looked like this was the cure for what ails us. The Salk's vaccine was too strong, and it gave people polio. Sabin's vaccine was a lighter dose, and because of the way it was applied, the immune system could fight it off. All right. Well, unfortunately, in the testing process, Dr. Sabin's vaccine is going to be determined by Dr. Bernice Eddy to have something wrong with it again. So here we go again. Bad news, Bernice. when you produce a vaccine, and Sabin's vaccine in particular, the polio virus was grown on monkey kidneys. You have to have uh, uh, live tissue to grow these vaccines on. So they used monkey kidneys, and these monkeys came from all over the place. Uh, they came from Africa. They came from Asia. Uh, you know, wherever you can get them, basically. And the whatever, which means that whatever viruses or whatever's in the monkey ends up in the vaccine. And Dr. Bernice Eddy, as she's testing this, after the first 100 million vaccines have already been distributed, okay, uh, that means 100 million doses have already gone out. The 100 million people have taken the sugar cube. We discover, Dr. Bernice Eddy discovers that there are 40, they call them monkey viruses that are unique to monkeys that are in the vaccine. Now, not all of those are a problem for humans, especially Americans, because we have been exposed to some of these, and so our bodies recognize them and fight them off. The problem was many of these viruses had mutated or changed form because the monkeys were caged together. And of course, they had sex with one another, they exchanged bodily fluids. And so the viruses mutated. And a couple of things that Dr. Bernice Eddy found that were alarming was these mutations, some of these mutations we did not recognize, or our bodies did not have the immunities to fight off once they changed form. And the second thing she learned was that they're sexually communicable. That's alarming. So that means whatever virus is in that vaccine, if you take the vaccine, it's now in your body, and then you can pass it on to your spouse or to your kids, whomever. And if it's a virus that your body doesn't recognize because it's one of these mutated viruses, that's when it becomes a problem. So the two viruses that she warned specifically about, she said, listen, there's two viruses that we don't that are going to be a problem in this vaccine. The first one is SV40. SV stands for simian virus. Simian for monkey, virus number 40. That is a cancer-causing virus. And the second one was SIV, which is simian immunodeficiency virus. At the time, we weren't real sure what that was. This is the 50s. We weren't familiar with this particular virus. Now, later, we become very familiar with it because SIV, the human version of that, is HIV, which can turn into AIDS after. And these are viruses that have mutated, and in particular, these two viruses, the American population did not have a tolerance for. And so Dr. Bernice comes out and she says, here we go again. She says, okay, well, there's a lot to like about this vaccine, but there is something that you need to be aware of. She said, both of these viruses have a 30-year incubation period, which means if we inoculate the population with this new vaccine today, let's just say 55, in 30 years, which would be 1985, we're going to have an explosion of cancer. We're not real sure what the SIV will turn into, but let's just use the one we know. For 30 years, people are going to be trading these viruses back and forth as they have sex, or they trade bodily fluids with one another. And it's not just going to be the however many millions of people we give the vaccine to, it's all the people that extrapolate it out through sexual contact. It's going to be everybody. And potentially the entire population is going to be open or vulnerable to a cancer epidemic after this incubation period wears off. We have 30 years. And she said, so you got to think about this now. It might cure polio in the short term, but the long term, we're going to have a big problem on our hand. At this time in the 50s, cancer was not the killer it is today. Cancer was way down the list as far as lethal diseases. And, look at the list today. Look where it is today. There's hardly a family in America hasn't been touched by cancer. But that wasn't the case in the 50s. And so Bernice is saying this is going to plant the seeds of a future epidemic. Maybe two. We're not real sure what the second one is, but for sure one. So think hard and long about what you're going to do here with this vaccine. Well, here we go again. The government, Nixon and NIH and CDC, they've already got egg on their face for what happened with the Cutter incident. They've already lost a bunch of money as a result of the Cutter incident. And so now here they've got a potential fix to the first problem. And now bad news Bernice is coming to them with another problem. So they have a choice. They can, this is like a do-over. They get a chance to do it right this time. They did it wrong the first time. They have a chance to do it right this time. Are they gonna come clean with the American public? Or are they gonna cover it up? Well, now remember, they are learning this after they've already inoculated 100 million American, mostly children, with a cancer-causing virus in the vaccine. So what do you think the government's going to do? They're going to cover that up. Can you imagine the panic it would cause if after they've already got, the cart before the horse, they went ahead with the vaccine before they got Bernice Eddy's report, counting on the fact that it was safe and effective, which they advertised it to be. And now, holy cow, they're finding out some bad news. And so they're not going to share this with the American people because they don't want the hassle. Not only are they not going to share it, the American people, they're going to double down on what they've already done. They've got 100 million more polio vaccines in the pipeline. They've already paid for, and so we now know. Evidence shows, this is documented, that the first 100 million doses that went out, there a case can be made. It was an accident. A case can be made. It was an accident made out of ignorance. A case can also be made. They got ahead of themselves and jumped the gun and administered the vaccine before waiting for Bernice Eddy's report. Nevertheless, let's assume the best. Okay, it was a mistake. Now's the time to come clean and clean up your mistake. But that's not what our government does. Our government administered 98 million more vaccines or doses knowingly. Now they know. They have the evidence in their hands that the polio vaccine is contaminated with two viruses. One is cancer causing, the other is SIV, which I'm just saying at that time, they didn't know what that was. We do now, but they didn't. If they halt, the cost benefit analysis they're making is if we halt the vaccines now, it's going to alert the public that the first 100 million, there's something wrong with them. And people are going to get alarmed. And furthermore, it's going to mean the loss of a lot more money. And I think ultimately that's what won the day. It's all this money that we've spent already. And so they've basically made a decision. We want to cure what ails us now, and then we'll worry about cancer and SIV later. So the panic is now over polio. So let's cure that now. We'll worry about cancer and all that later. So what that means is between 1955 and 63, that 8-year span there, 198 million Americans, a lot of those are kids, received the polio vaccine, the sugar cube, put it on their tongue, dissolves, and polio ceased to be a problem. And so it looks like it worked. It looks like it was successful. This campaign using the Sabin vaccine fixed the problem of the original vaccine. Polio ceases to be a problem. But if you're Richard Nixon, you know what's coming. If you're Bernice Eddy, you know what's coming. If you're the CDC and the NIH, you know what's coming. Okay, which is interesting. If you fast forward, one of the first acts that President Richard Nixon takes or makes after he becomes president is he declares a war on cancer. And that was in the 70s when cancer wasn't even it ranked way down the list. People are probably scratching it. Why is he declaring war on cancer? Because he knows what's coming. And time is running short. By the time we get to his presidency, you remember, everybody thought he was going to win in 60, and he lost, and that set him back 8 years. So he doesn't win until 68. And then early 70s, he declares war on cancer. And because he knows the clock's been ticking since 55. And by the time we get to the mid 70s, when this war on cancer is going strong, we're 20 years into the ticking clock. And he knows we're down to 10 years before this cancer epidemic hits. And I've always wondered about that. It's just interesting to me why all of a sudden out of the blue he declares war on cancer. In fact, it even predates that when he went to Russia on his trip. That summer, what was it, 72? I think it was 72. He goes to China and then he goes to Russia. I think it was February of 72. He went to China, and in May of 72 he went to Russia. And one of the agreements he and Brezhnev arrived at was together we were going to work on curing cancer. Nixon had this phobia about cancer. And of course, Brezhnev, this is Russia we're talking about. Albert Sabin is Russian. He conducted a lot of his field tests for his Sabin for his vaccine in Russia. So I haven't studied what the Russians knew, but I know what Nixon knew. And it's interesting to me that the two countries involved in the Sabin vaccine are basically taking preventive measures in the early 70s to cure cancer. And then Nixon declares a war on cancer in the early 70s. All of this is leading up to the mid 80s when the cancer epidemic is going to arrive. So it's like Nixon's prescient, or he has this prophetic knowledge of something. Yeah, he did. It's called the Bernice Eddy report. He read it. He knew what was coming. And sure enough, in the mid 80s, all you got to do is look at the statistics. In the mid 80s, all of a sudden, boom, soft tissue cancer rates in America just explode, absolutely explode. Breast cancer, prostate, brain, all these different cancers, lung cancers, just explode. And everybody's scratching out, what changed? And what changed was this was planted. This was a seed that had been planted in the human population here in the United States back in the 50s and the early 60s. The polio vaccine, the Sabin vaccine, and it's just been lying dormant. And then after that incubation period expires, boom, that's what you get. And then we also have in the mid 80s a new disease called AIDS, which I remember when that burst on the scene. That Rock Hudson out in Hollywood got it. When I was living in Indiana, a little boy named Ryan White got it. He's like 13 years old. Everybody thought it was a homosexual disease at first. Then it turns into, Ryan White gets it. He's a hemophiliac. He got blood transfusions and a contaminated needle gave it to him. And now there's a panic about this new disease, which there's no cure for, AIDS. And it seemingly came out of nowhere. And it didn't come out of nowhere. Bernice Eddy warned about these two viruses and said, these monkey viruses are in the vaccine. If you give this, if you distribute it, if you administer these doses to the American population, in 30 years, we're going to have a minimum of one epidemic outbreak. Of course, we now know it was two. So in going back to answer my question at the beginning of this episode, how did the cure for polio create the conditions for two future epidemics? Well, here you see it. By curing polio, we basically introduced a cancer epidemic. Cancer was not considered an epidemic until the mid 80s. And so it introduces cancer, it introduces AIDS. And this is even the CDC in 2013 finally had to admit about the 98 million Americans. Now, they're saying, well, the first 100 million were accidental, so we're not on the hook for that. But we did administer 98 million contaminated doses. And of course, they only admit to the SV40. They don't admit to SIV. But that was July 11, 2013. They put it on their website, the CDC website, and then it had so many hits that they took it down. They took it down, but people got screenshots of it and stuff. So anyway, going back to my original questions today, they ignored Bernice Eddy twice. They didn't ignore her just once. The Salk vaccine, she warned. They ignored her. The Sabin vaccine, she warned. They ignored. And to the to our detriment both times. You know, the Salk vaccine had to be shut down. It killed kids, paralyzed kids. The Sabin vaccine was administered to almost 200 million Americans. And the payoff for that, it doesn't happen until 30 years later. Now, in the interim period, we talked about Nixon declaring war on cancer. That became the emphasis. Okay, let's cure polio now. And we have a 30-year head start to work on a cure for cancer. So when it hits, we'll have a cure ready. We just never figured it out. We never did come up with a cure. And this is where good science turns bad. Because when we get into tomorrow's episode, which let's see, today's episode 32, so that'll be episode 33, we start to see the distortion of this science to be manipulated or exploited for uses in the Cold War. In other words, as a bioweapon. And that's where Oswald and Dr. Ochsner, and Dr. Mary Sherman, Judith Ferry, and all the David Ferry, and all these people come back into play because they now have the seeds of something. They now have a vaccine that has cancer cells in it. Is there any way they can speed it up so that there isn't a 30-year incubation? They can use it as a tool, like a bioweapon, a tool of assassination, and they can predict the timeline, and they can shrink the timetable into something that would be effective used as a weapon. So we'll get into that tomorrow. But anyway, those are the, I'm trying to remember my third question. But the second question was, how was how did this vaccine for polio turn into two epidemics? So we introduced that, cancer and AIDS. And I forget my third question, but hopefully I answered it. I don't want to scroll back through all my, well, here, let me do that because I want to make sure I answered that question. So let's see, what was my third question? All right. What did the government admit in 2013? So we just answered that. That was that the CDC admitted that, yes, we did give 98 million contaminated doses. Of course, we know that it was really 198. They only admitted to 98. The first 100 million, they said, well, we get a mulligan on that because we didn't know. So I think the moral of this story is that people hire folks to test products. They should wait for the testing. You know, when you get in a rush, and I can understand the motivation. And I think this applies to what happened during COVID. You know, you get in a rush. I mean, they even called it Operation Warp Speed, right? Let's get this thing out there. Let's get this thing out there. And you short circuit the testing. And you start administering this thing, and then you get the test results back. And you find out, oh, well, by then the cat's out of the bag, the genie's out of the bottle, and you don't want to go back and say, well, everybody that already had it, it's tough luck for you. You know, you're going to get cancer. This is going to happen. Something bad's going to happen to you. But going forward, we're going to make all the fixes. Why don't you just wait till all the testing is done so you know what the problems are? But, you know, we did that in the Salk vaccine, and they went ahead anyway, even though they knew the results. So this is why I said yesterday this would be controversial, because all this got replicated. History repeats. All this got replicated in the last 3 or 4 years. And we had all the same issues. And if you know your history, such as what we're presenting today, you know that the government doesn't have a strong track record of waiting for the test results or even honoring the test results. And once it's out there, they're going to Katie bar the door. They're going full steam ahead with it. And they're going to claim and proclaim that it's safe and effective, even though they may know it's not. And so if you know your history, and we get in the same situation again, you're a little bit skeptical about everything you're being told because it sounds suspiciously the same as what everybody was being told in the 50s and 60s. And you're saying, I'm not sure I want to take into my body something that you don't even know what it does. Or maybe you do know, but you're denying it. And you're going ahead with it anyway to cure the panic and make the money. So that's why history is so important, isn't it? You know, you really need to, it does repeat, and generations sometimes don't learn from prior generations, or sometimes they do. And if you are aware of history and how history repeats and how these exact same scenarios have played out before, you can make an informed decision. and then wait just a little bit of time and wait for all the promises that they made about whatever it is, and watch them all be proven false. And then you, if you hesitate, or if you just said, no, I'm going to wait, good for you, because you made the right decision. And everybody who rushed in made the wrong decision. And, you can't really blame the population. Population trusts what the government tells them. Well, that's the problem, or potentially the problem. So anyway, that's a lot to include in today's episode. Tomorrow, we will begin introducing the Medical Manhattan Project itself. This has all been the backstory. Now we have something in our hands that, if we, like, say, an agency like the CIA wants to work with this vaccine that has the cancer virus in it, you could weaponize it. You have it in your grasp. You could go two ways with this. You could fix the problems and produce a vaccine that cures cancer, but you could also weaponize it. So tomorrow we're going to start seeing which direction the CIA goes with this, and how it involves Lee Harvey Oswald, all this cast of characters that we've been discussing from the beginning of these videos that we've been talking about. So anyway, if you enjoyed today, feel free to subscribe to my channel. It's free. Also hit the thumbs up, the notification bell, so you get notified of future content when I drop it. I have a website, standards+historyacademy.com. Feel free to check that out. And I look forward to seeing you all. Keep the comments coming, and let's just keep moving down, taking this journey together. Thank you. Everybody have a great day.